So you agree that these three buildings are not there anymore? Some people said the whole thing is a computer generated.
That's one. Bingo.
It's Juneteenth now.
It's Juneteenth, all right. I'm emancipated. Welcome, everyone, to the regional meeting here in Los Angeles of the Coalition on Political Assassinations. This is an anniversary year for COPA, and every 5 years we hold meetings in a series of cities, and we have annual meetings and have for the last 14, well, this will be the 14th year, in Dallas, Texas. We were formed in 1994. But on the 5th anniversary years, we've gone to Memphis and to Los Angeles, as well as Dallas. And this year, because the site of one of the major assassinations of the 60s has been reopened as a museum and memorial center and educational center in New York, the Audubon Ballroom, where Malcolm X was killed, we were able to co-sponsor an event there on the 43rd anniversary of Malcolm's assassination. And we've also had a kind of banner year in terms of press attention. We've been on Coast to Coast. We were on Sirius Satellite Radio. This meeting, despite its turnout, which is, we're filling all the chairs, but that's because we don't have enough. But this meeting was actually mentioned in the Associated Press news event calendar for the week. And so everywhere up on the net you can find that this meeting is taking place, if anyone wanted to know about new evidence and who killed Robert Kennedy. We got calls from ABC News. There's Japanese national TV here and perhaps some other press. But we are also attempting to live stream this, and we're having some technical difficulties, but we're doing our best. Now we're down to like hooking it to a cell phone modem or something, but so they probably won't get me, but they'll get something of the night and the rest of the weekend, we hope, at our website, which is politicalassassinations.com. And it's been hopping. We had I think about 700 or 800 hits already today on the blog, and we had about 1,500 yesterday. And so people are looking at the site, and we're putting up a lot of new information all the time about the different political assassinations. A little housekeeping agenda we're going to do tonight. Have the panel, have some speakers afterwards, and Mark Sobel is going to show his new documentary film. And then tomorrow we reconvene. As soon as we can get back in here, there's a meeting of a Republican group or something till about 11, but whenever they take off, we get the room back. So maybe if they see us outside, they'll leave sooner. But something. Well, I don't want us to get sick. And then we're going to have a whole lineup of speakers tomorrow, and a special presentation of some early outtake interviews that was done by Ted Chirac that haven't ever been heard before. And also a last-minute addition to the agenda, Darwin Horn, who, when I was trying to find another place, I called the Hilton, and the salesperson told me about this guy. He's 82 years old, and he just wrote his autobiography. He's 30 years in the Secret Service, and he's the Secret Service guy that was assigned on the night of June the 5th by Lyndon Johnson to cover Bobby Kennedy, because prior to that, candidates were not covered by the Secret Service. And Johnson changed the order that night and sent this guy 6:30 in the morning to cover Robert Kennedy and the family after the shooting. So we can't blame all of this one on the Secret Service, but it should be interesting. And I talked to him, and he wanted to come out and take questions and talk to us. So that's a late-minute addition. But we've got really great speakers this time, and Ted Schrocks with us on Sunday morning, and we have tomorrow Lisa Pease and Bill Turner. And Michael Calder, Summer Reese, who's connected to with Teeter in the case earlier, and Shane O'Sullivan and his film, RFK Must Die, and some authors will be bringing their books, and there's resources here. So, for them as want to eat with us through the weekend, we're going to have a series of buffets, and part of the registration price if you want to join us, or else you can eat in the diner itself or wherever you like. We also are going to be trying to talk about a broader range of things in some of the future of COPA events, but we've had an active, if not lucrative year. And appreciate the turnout here. It's going to maybe help me get out of town without the hotel arresting me. It's almost happened in Memphis. But we are, we're working still in D.C. on many of the issues that started COPA. We were originally formed by a number of organizations basically to implement the release of files under the JFK Assassination Records Act. And with the help of Representative Cynthia McKinney at the time, who's going to be speaking later tonight, at two different points in her career in Congress, I helped her draft and introduce a Martin Luther King Records Act, and I'm working right now to get it reintroduced in the current Congress, and with some support from some of the previous people who signed on to it. So we've continued to do that. We've joined with Open Government and other coalitions to support government transparency and support whistleblowers and some other things. So our name has been around a little broader than it has been, and just having a website finally is making a big difference. So if you're interested, we have two more events this year. We have an annual meeting that we do on June the 10th in Washington, D.C., right after this conference ends. We'll be back there at a memorial plaque and monument on American University campus where John F. Kennedy on June the 10th, 1963, gave the speech where he called for an end to the Cold War, détente with the Soviet Union, and end to the arms race and no more nuclear weapons. And in some part sealed his fate with that talk, in the same way that I think Martin Luther King sealed his fate 1 year to the day before his death by coming out against the war in Vietnam. And that's a speech where he said, we're all mortal. We all live on the same planet. We all breathe the same air and drink the same water. We all want our kids to live in peace. And we're all mortal. And so he wanted to go a different direction than the Joint Chiefs and the people that make money off of war wanted to go. And so we commemorate that speech each year. And then November 21st to the 23rd, we will be in Dallas. We hold a annual moment of silence on the grassy knoll at 12:30 when we're not being blared out by a certain other organization that brings its loudspeakers, but we do our best to hold one there, and we're going to have more speakers and people for the 45th anniversary of John F. Kennedy this year. So that's a little background on us, but in addition to us being slightly more in the news, assassination has certainly been in the news. I brought, just for remembrance sake, a talk that was delivered on April 4th, 1968 in Indianapolis, Indiana, the night of the shooting of Dr. Martin Luther King and his murder by Bobby Kennedy. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, he spoke just impromptu to a small group there. I'm only going to talk to you just for a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort in this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States. It's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and with a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white among whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, and he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. And my favorite poem was Aeschylus, and he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. That's not all the speech, but I thought I'd commemorate that because it interlinks the three assassinations and some of the sense. And we called, the Martin Luther King conference this year Killing the Dream, and this one we called Killing Hope, and then Dallas we called Killing Democracy. And I think that that's what a lot of it was about. But there was a very good article, and Bill Turner mentioned it to me too, in the San Francisco Chronicle on the front page within the last week. 40 years after RFK's death, questions linger, quoting some of the people that will be speaking tonight and others in the case. And so the press has at least begun to put, on the mainstream page the questions that we've been asking for the last 40 years. And it's interesting that we kind of come in the back door with RFK after all this time of suppressing the others, that they could consider it in his case. But, he's quite well known, and, people are thinking about it. And then in addition to that, we've had a little help in the news. Washington Post, May 24th, Clinton's sorry for remark about RFK assassination. Hillary Clinton made a reference to, it seemed to be sort of anything could happen, before this primary is over. And remember that Bobby Kennedy was, went into June and was assassinated. So that caused quite a bit of flap. And she drew rebuke and then, made an apology, but something was on her mind. And you may also noticed in the news that Mike Huckabee made a kind of inappropriate comment about Obama, jumping from being shot at. And so, and then just yesterday in the Boston Globe, or the Herald, no, it's the Herald Tribune, I'm sorry, we had a commentary in that direction from, of all people, Priscilla Johnson McMillan. For those that don't know Priscilla McMillan, she was North American Newspaper Alliance in the 1960s, which was a front for both British and U.S. intelligence, formed at the end of World War II. Lord Beaverbrook, the main person on the Eastern desk in Russia in charge of it was Ian Fleming, very high up in naval intelligence in the British circles, and his brother as well. Ian Fleming employed for his Russia desk Sidney Goldberg, and Sidney Goldberg's wife, Lucienne Goldberg, who you may remember from Zippergate, if I should call it that. But the question of Monica was spread by her still using North American Newspaper Alliance. Aileen Mosby also worked for them. And both Aileen Mosby and Priscilla Johnson interviewed the defector, Lee Harvey Oswald, in Moscow. Priscilla, we now know from the House Select Committee documents released under the JFK Act, was a witting asset of the Central Intelligence Agency in some of her work. And to show you the importance of this person, I mean, not only does she help to establish, along with Aileen Mosby, Oswald's fake credentials as a defector. There were actually 9 defectors that went into the Soviet Union the same month, posing as defectors from the Office of Naval Intelligence, Oswald included, and all 9 came back the same month. And Marina got a little confused in her testimony, and when she's asked how she met Oswald and how he got in the Soviet Union, she actually tells the story of another of the 9 defectors, not Oswald's story. So she got him a little confused. But she's establishing that story. And then when Svetlana Stalin, if you can think somebody at this level of importance, Svetlana Stalin, Joseph Stalin's daughter, defects to the United States. Where would you send her? You mean you send her off to, some nice couple, to live in a house and hang around, or do you send her to a debriefing team that knows what they want to ask? So she ends up going immediately to the parents of Priscilla Johnson in those days, and then she comes home to her parents' house and helps Svetlana translate her memoirs. I'm sure leaving some parts out. She later writes Marina and Lee, another cover-up book in the operation. So just recently she's back in the news, and she's been in the news constantly as a commentator to try to debunk any new evidence that shows conspiracy. But in this one she goes the extra mile, and she says that Mrs. Clinton shouldn't have been mentioning assassination, because the way assassinations happen is that people hear about them and they're contagious, she says. And so Oswald heard about an attempt on Khrushchev, and that's how he thought up the idea. And he heard about Medgar Evers, and he thought, well, I'll go shoot somebody. And then, James O. Ray heard about somebody else being shot, and then he went and shot somebody. So it's a contagious disease. It passes from one of us to the next of us in a totally random fashion. I don't exactly understand. Also, the problem is that the people that are diagnosed as having the worst cases of it actually didn't do the shootings, so I don't know how it works as a diagnosis, It's probably something like ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. I'm trying to figure out the epidemiology of that. There's a lot of news coverage of problems with the evidence over the years within the last year. Here's a Washington Post headline, FBI's forensic test full of holes. And it shows that the forensic test used all the way back to the 60s by the FBI is actually a flawed test and came to the wrong results in hundreds and hundreds of ballistic tests, but it's a specific one that was also used in the Kennedy shooting. And so there's new evidence out. Or there was an Italian study of Oswald's gun, the Mannlicher Carcano, that's supposed to be the murder weapon, in which they determined that to fire even 3 shots out of the gun took close to 18 seconds, nowhere near to the few 6 seconds that Oswald's supposed to have done all the shooting in. Assassination documents surfaced in Dallas, and there was a comment that they might be turned over to the 6th floor museum, which I'm sure would preserve them forever without any of us seeing it. But we called the DA, and he put them up online, and there's a CD available of them here at the conference today. And they're not particularly revealing, but it's interesting that there are new documents. And then we also had Judge Thunheim, the former chair of the Assassination Record Review Board, write to him and call him, and we started a letter writing and fax campaign to say those are assassination-related records. They fall under the JFK Act. They should be sent to the National Archives. You can send a copy, if you like, to the 6th Floor Museum, which is a private museum, but they belong to the rest of us. Just like much of our history that should belong to us is buried all the time, but that's part of what we're doing, and COPA is fighting through these different models like the JFK Act to start to take our history back. And you may know that our first president for COPA, Cyril Wecht, very well-known forensic pathologist, has been under legal attack since the time of the recent appointment of, under Gonzales, of the political DAs. And even though without a single person testifying, the jury locked and couldn't come to a decision, the prosecutor said immediately that she was going to renew the charges. And this is somebody that originally brought over 80 federal charges against him at once and dropped down to 40. And they came in and confiscated his papers, which were supposed to have to do with financial discrepancies. At the coroner's office, they confiscated all of his JFK records, all of the assassinations and murders that he's worked on. They came and grabbed all the records because they obviously have something to do with accounting. But it's just that it's sort of the story that won't die no matter what they do with it. It keeps rising back up out of the grave, and then there's, in addition to the major political assassinations, strings of suspicious political deaths that we've looked at. The most recent one that I was taking a little bit of detailed look at is this one, D.C. Madam hanged herself. I mean, there's somebody that knew quite a bit about political dirt, and she was facing a prison sentence, just couldn't stand the thought of going back to prison, so hanged herself at her mother's house. But, great American suicides. And then we have new resources out this year, and we'll be talking about some of them. Dr. Robert Jolink and Phillip Van Praag are speaking tonight, have their book, An Open and Shut Case. And Shane O'Sullivan has this out just recently, Who Killed Bobby? And it's evidence that he's worked on along with the film that he did. Robert Blair Kaiser, who did initial work that cast some doubt, at least, on the official version and the hypnotic questions about Sirhan, just put out a paperback but updated version of RFK Must Die. So we're filled with the resources, coming out again at this critical time. And I think also important in that is the release of a 4-volume set called, well, actually 5-volume, called the Indices of the Assassinations of America, but Paris Flammond's work with Garrison, and he did 4 volumes, and then this is just basically the index of all the volumes, but that's just recently out. But Dar's story is the name of Darwin Hunt's book, and he'll come tomorrow and probably have some copies with him. So this is all basically new evidence in the case, and it keeps emerging, and it keeps also bolstering the old evidence. When ABC News called me, they said, well, does anybody besides Phillip Van Praag believe this? And I said, well, I said, we've had evidence over the years. We didn't have this particular audio evidence, but we've had Herbert McDonald, probably the leading ballistic expert in the country, who developed the Balliscan macrograph, so you can turn 2 bullets in sync 360 degrees, take a picture of them, make the picture large and see the specific rifling. But he said not only in the rifling, but in the gross characteristics, the cantilevering of the bullets, and Robert Kennedy didn't match the gun that they said had done the killing. We had the problem of Noguchi's autopsy showing the bullets too close. And, you know, some of these things will come out, but there were too many holes in the pantry that would be accounted for by the single gun. There were many, many aspects that we've known over the years and had photographic evidence and other witness evidence of a second gun in the pantry. We don't have to say this is just one guy who believes this, you know, listen to one audio tape, and as you'll hear, I'm sure, tonight. Also, interestingly enough, Abraham Bolden just did a book, a former black Secret Service agent who was locked up on false charges in Chicago after intervening and trying to save JFK in a Chicago plot to kill him that involved a guy named Thomas Arthur Valley, who actually had Lee Harvey Oswald ID on him when he was picked up in Chicago just before the event, and who ties into COINTELPRO operations later. So there's connecting things all through this, but there are researchers, and I want to say a special thanks to the people who come to COPA, and also certainly the speakers, but also people like Paul Nara and Mike Nurko, unheralded people who come and do the work with us. Carl Chatsky came down from Seattle, has been helping us out a great deal. Summer Reese has been plugging in here at the LA and other people, and John Garrity in Ireland, who's been doing our website. But it is in the news. Here's Vanity Fair, if you haven't seen it, that's out on the stands this month. It's got Bobby Wright on the cover. So we're in the news, and there's things to be said about it. And so I've asked some of the speakers tonight, they're going to do a detailed presentation that they don't want broadcast or recorded, and we're honoring that, but for a variety of reasons, they didn't want that portion covered. But I was asking them if they could, on this first panel that we have, talk a little bit about, just in general, about their findings and their conclusions. If there's any press questions, we could take a few now. Then we'll go into the portion where I ask you to turn off your cameras and your recorders and just use your eyes and your ears and your brain, hopefully. And then we'll go back to audience questions, and that'll be recorded. And so our first panel of distinguished guests here, I can't hold a candle to any of them, but there's Dr. Robert Jolink, a former president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. I'm sure I won't do him justice, but he's worked on the case for many years, and he's recently come out with this book. And Phillip Van Praag, an audio engineer and expert and analyst that worked on this recently released tape, and also Paul Schrade, who's come to COPA conferences before, who was tireless on the case and keeping it open and trying to work on it and get the truth out to the public. And he is both. He worked for Bobby Kennedy's campaign, and he was both an eyewitness and a victim in the pantry, was also shot himself. So that's our first panel, and then after that we're going to have Sirhan's new attorney, Dr. William Pepper, an internationally known lawyer and barrister, and he'll be introduced by, and then the guest that follows him, former Georgia 4th District Representative Cynthia McKinney, and current candidate on the Green Party ticket for the 2008 presidential race. If you want an economy of voting to get both a black and a woman in the office, you can vote for Cynthia. There's many other reasons to vote for her, but You can have 2 in 1 that way. And I was telling her today that for you nervous Nellies who want to vote for Obama so you don't get McCain, well, go ahead and vote for Obama, but fund Cynthia. Because with Cynthia, you'll get a third party, and a third party will change the whole political dynamic of this country, and it only takes 5%. And those 5% won't be anybody that would vote for either Obama or McCain. They're going to be people that don't vote and that come out of the constituencies that she spoke to. And I was fortunate enough and honored enough to be her staff member in Congress for a period, and I currently serve as a press secretary for her campaign, so I have fun with that. And mostly alternative press, as you can imagine, but we do our best to get our head above the water. So, but she doesn't get the mention she certainly deserves. And then Mark Sobel also brought his film, and we'll be showing that sort of after hours with some commentary by him. So we've got a full night ahead, and I don't know if we've solved our modem or live stream problems for this first little opening salvo, but hopefully somebody will get it out one way or the other. But we've got our techs working diligently to put us out to the rest of the world. We're embedded on about 50 blogs tonight, and people are waiting to see this beyond the doors here. But there's part of this that only you will see because you came to COPA. Thank you. And I'll let you take over your panel.
Thank you, John Judge, and thanks for inviting us. And we hope that we have enough to say here to convince you of our case. On a personal note, I'd like to let you know my wife is here, if she'll raise her hand at the back, and our friend Diane Smith, and my nephew is here, Max. Where are you, Max? And one of our former attorneys on the case up until the early 90s is here too, Marion Barrett. She's back working with us, and I'd like to also a friend of mine who's a judge, been a judge. We worked together in the ACLU, Ken Chotner over here. Anyway, my job tonight is to sort of introduce the issue and leave it up to the experts on my right and my left who know more about this case than I do. Ted Chirac here should be recognized too, who initiated most of the investigation back in 1968, and his film is still a good one, The Second Gun, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I have a personal interest in this case, not only because I was a victim of the shooting that night, but because I was a very close friend and ally of Robert Kennedy. He was the best of the politicians I'd ever known, and I was in California politics since 1948. He was able to work with people at a much better level than anybody else that I knew. He was the only person who walked the picket lines up in Delano with the farm workers. He joined the farm workers' struggle. Nobody ever did that before. Gene McCarthy refused to do it, and so did Hubert Humphrey. And but he felt, as Cesar Chavez says, he could see through the eyes of the poor. And so his campaign was based upon ending the war in Vietnam and also restarting the war on poverty, which was a victim of the Vietnam War. We got a really good start in Watts and East LA and the farm workers in organizing through community action. So Bob Kennedy was very important to me in my life. This case has been hanging in there for now 40 years. I didn't get involved until 1975, and maybe 74, but Allard Lowenstein, who ran the Dump Johnson movement, had been a member of the Congress, a very close friend of Kennedy's. He brought me into the case. I refused to get involved. I actually left Los Angeles early on, and because I just couldn't handle the city at that point. So, and I worked with Ted Chirac after a while. I resisted him for a while, but he's very persuasive, and I did get involved. So let me just stop there and ask Bob Jolink to continue as this summary portion of our.
I'm usually asked, when did I first get involved in this case? Now, Teddy Chirac precedes me but he's younger than I am, so that's okay. I've been involved in this case for 39 and a half years. I got involved in February of 1969 at a meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, which was held at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, Illinois. And at that meeting, I was asked by a forensic pathologist by the name of William Eckert if I would come down to his room to meet with him and Dr. Thomas Noguchi, both friends of mine whom I've known for a long time. And I said, indeed, I would go there, and I did. When I arrived at the room of Eckert and Noguchi, I was presented the autopsy protocol of Tom Noguchi, and I was asked to read it and to comment on it. The reason I was asked to read it and comment on it because I was in the medical legal field, and as a lawyer, they wanted my opinion. And I was a trial lawyer for many years. I've been a licensed attorney now for 57 years. 58th, that's starting up with June 15th. So I read the autopsy protocol, and after that we had a conversation that lasted about 2.5 hours. We're discussing the ramifications of Tom's findings. We discussed the ways and means of investigating this matter in a proper manner. I got the distinct impression at that time from reading the autopsy and from the conversation that we had that the bullets that entered Senator Kennedy's body and his clothing were all contact wounds or contact bullets, shots. That meant that they were close enough to leave powder residue not only on his jacket but also on his head, 1/4 of an inch away from the skull and approximately 1 to 3 inches behind the right earlobe. That alone stirred some inquiring thoughts in my mind. In addition to that, when we found out or knew that there was 4 shots that had hit Senator Kennedy or went through his clothing, one did, I then looked at the rest of the autopsy protocol and read all those specific data, and then discussed the facts of this case with those 2 gentlemen and other people who were in the room. At that time, it was already noted that 5 other people besides Senator Kennedy had been shot. The first one being shot was Paul Schrade to my right. Paul had been shot in the forehead, and Sirhan had fired 2 shots, and then there was a long pause. Now, we're talking about long pauses, it's not an hour. It's just a matter of a couple seconds or less. And then there was a flurry of shots. And as a result of that, we said, well, you got 5 victims and you got 4 to Kennedy. At least when I went to grammar school, we were taught that if you had 5 and 4, it comes out to 9. And if it comes out to 9, then how do you get 9 shots out of an 8-shot revolver? That was the first problem that hit us. From that moment on, throughout the years, every time I'd go to the annual meeting of the Academy, there would be a discussion particularly by the criminalistic division, or the people in that division. And many a times we talk about what new things happen. Bill Harper, who was a friend of Teddy Chirac's, had done some investigation. I believe it was in 1971, if I recall correctly. And Bill told me a couple of stories that made my cockles on my back shrink a little bit. The one in particular that he told me was about the time he was called to testify before the grand jury. And it was going to be the following day that he was supposed to be going there. And while he was driving his car, there was a car following him. And as his car hit a dip in the road and came up, a shot rang out. And so Bill and his friend went down to the head of or the fellow who had been the head of the police investigating unit, and they indeed found a slug in the back of his car. Now, he didn't get killed, but there was no investigation apparently but either. But that raises some interesting questions when you get into it. But again, that is the beginning. Last year, in 2007, I met an interesting fellow who happens to be a landsman of mine. I'm Dutch, and Van Praag is Dutch, so naturally, I went this way. We Dutch people close together stick 'em, as they say. But anyway, I was invited to take part in the production of a documentary for Discovery Times Channel. And it was held at the studio of Van Praag. So I went to his studio and I listened to him, and he became a very interesting subject to listen to. Very intelligent, very knowledgeable, very studious, typical engineer, dot the I's, cross the T's, and that type of thing. But one thing that interested me about Phil was the fact that he soon let me know that he was not a person who believed in a conspiracy in this particular case, insofar as it related to what he was involved in. And I also informed him that I was not a person who advocated these conspiracy theories because it was not germane to what I was working upon. So I told him about my physical facts, and he told me about his forensic science engineering audio discoveries. They fit like a glove in hand. And we said, my goodness, we're both on the same track. We both came to the same conclusion, and we didn't have to get into a conspiracy theory. Now, a lot of people are involved in conspiracy theories, and it's perfectly all right. We do not denigrate that at all. We think that people should go on investigating those thoughts if they actually believe that that took place. And we hope someday they can put it together if they can. But our findings are based strictly on physical facts and on forensic science. So please, when you leave here tonight, don't think that Phil and I are conspiracy buffs, because we're not. We're neither conspiracy buffs and we're not nuts. So if the other people want to say that, they're wrong. Know it before we start. It's very simple. Our premise is quite simple. Sirhan did not, and Sirhan could not have killed Senator Kennedy on the night of June 5th, 1968. It was physically impossible to happen. And I'll leave Van Praag give you the very interesting details of his work and his discoveries. And we'll get into this in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bob. It's a pretty hard act to follow with Dr. Jolink.
Well, I'm a
after this,
Republican, so you can do that.
But we don't necessarily follow each other in all facets, but we both are Dutch, and that's a good start, I guess. What I'll be speaking about primarily later on this evening, going into some detail, are the facts related to discoveries that I made regarding a very interesting recording that was made actually inadvertently in and around the embassy room of the Ambassador Hotel on the night that Senator Kennedy was shot. The fellow who made this recording, journalist by the name of Stanislaw Brzezinski, was not even aware at the time he was making that recording that his recorder was still turned on. He had placed his recorder and microphone up at the podium area while Senator Kennedy was giving his victory statement. And after Senator Kennedy had finished and had left the podium area, Mr. Brzezinski came up to the podium, retrieved his microphone and recorder, and in fact we have some detailed shots of him as he was gathering his materials. He inadvertently shut off, or on purpose shut off, the microphone switch, but fortunate for the rest of the world, about 7 seconds later he switched it back on. He was not aware that he had done that, but he took his microphone and his recorder and then moved to try to catch up to the Kennedy entourage, which had already proceeded out the back off of the stage area and through an anteroom, and then through a kitchen pantry on their way to the Colonial Room for a press conference. And of course the shooting took place while they were in this kitchen pantry area. Mr. Brzezinski, instead of leaving through the back of the stage area, left via a side, on the side of the stage, I guess to the right of the stage area as the audience would see it, down some stairs and proceeded through a doorway that led to the kitchen pantry. And it was while he was coming down those stairs that the shots began. And there were all of the major TV networks, of course, were there recording in the embassy room area. There were numerous film and audio people from all around the world capturing this gala event with Senator Kennedy winning the California primary. There were hundreds and hundreds of people in the embassy room, hundreds of people just downstairs beneath the embassy room in the ambassador ballroom, all very victoriously in celebration of this victory. It's quite ironic that with all of this recording going on, that there was no recording, known recording, of the procession of the Kennedy entourage from the embassy room to the colonial room. We do have a lot of network and film footage that allowed us to synchronize the movements of Mr. Brzezinski as he left the stage area. And we have sounds on his recording that have been synchronized with network recordings and film recordings to precisely time the Brzezinski recording and to time the moment, the instant, in fact, at which the shots began. Unfortunately, all of the microphones for the networks were placed well within the embassy room and to the back, and were unable to capture the actual shots. But Mr. Brzezinski, striving to catch up to the Kennedy entourage, proceeded down the stairs, through the open doorway, through a portion of the anteroom there just adjacent to the kitchen pantry, and then into the kitchen pantry itself. And it wasn't until he actually got into the pantry that he realized the enormity of what had just occurred there. When you saw Senator Kennedy on the floor, you saw Paul Schrade here on the floor, the pools of blood, people at that point in time recognizing, of course, what had happened, and the shrieks and screams and shouts and yells, and then many, many people striving to get into the pantry area, and just all chaos erupted at that time. Mr. Brzezinski continued to record at that point, being now cognizant of what had occurred, and continued for maybe another 25 to 30 minutes. We also have synchronized portions of his recording at the tail end when he had then left the embassy room. And we have a picture sequence, for example, as he crossed the path of a network reporter, Lou Allison, I believe, who was interviewing an eyewitness. And so we have Lou Allison statements and the statements of this eyewitness synchronized with the audio portion of that from Mr. Brzezinski's recording. So we've done quite a bit of work over the last 3 years. Fortunately, I was able to gain access to the California State Archives, which had the only known copy of the Brzezinski recording that we knew of at the time. Since that time, we've come up with 2 others. At that time, that was the only one that we knew of. And we were able to gain access to the state archives to make digitized copies of their copy so as to have the best possible available audio information to work with for our analysis. And this was in stark contrast to what the CSA had made available to the public, which were cassettes, which were 2 or 3 generations even further beyond the original Brzezinski recording copy that they had been given. So we feel quite fortunate in having that opportunity, and just this within the last several months, as a matter of fact, I've been able to gain access to 2 additional copies of the Brzezinski recording. These were retained by the FBI, and basically we have a very good chain of custody established now of that recording from the time that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, interviewed Mr. Brzezinski at the urging of the FBI. Brzezinski was in an apartment in Montreal, Canada at the time, February '69. They interviewed Brzezinski. They made a copy of his original cassette recording. They sent that copy to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., which then proceeded to analyze it to determine if there was anything of use in the assassination case. The recording itself is unfortunately of rather poor quality, as Mr. Brzezinski was 40 feet or more from the actual site of the shooting as the shooting began. He was proceeding in that direction, and so there is a subtle improvement in the clarity of the shot sounds from the beginning. But overall, the quality of the recording is not very good. The FBI nonetheless made 2 copies of that source tape that they had obtained, and they sent those 2 copies to their FBI field office in Los Angeles. One of those 2 copies was forwarded to the Los Angeles Police Department. They retained it until the 87-88 time frame when it was turned over to the CSA, along with tens of thousands of documents and other audio and visual materials. But the other copy, that second copy that had been sent to the FBI field office, was later returned to FBI headquarters, and it was stored then for all of these years along with their source copy that they obtained from the RCMP. The source copy was denoted QC 36. And so in the presentation a little bit later, we'll show you some documentation along that chain of custody, and quite a bit of it is also contained in our book, An Open and Shut Case. So we'll be getting into those details. The findings, the specific findings that I came up with over the last 3 years, 2 of which were covered in the, at least somewhat covered in the Discovery Times channel documentary that Bob spoke about a few minutes ago. The first being the discovery of 13 shot sounds from that recording. This was using a variety of techniques, the most obvious of which, of course, and what everyone tries at first, is just listening to the tape in a quiet room, and that sort of thing. And that works to an extent, but the quality of the tape is so low, and the background noise is so high, such that it really requires additional means in order to draw out all of the information that's available in that recording. And I really don't fault the FBI in that sense. Looking back in 1969, the quality of the equipment that they had at that time compared to what's available today, it's not difficult to come to the same conclusion that they did. In fact, there are a number of investigators today and people who look at that tape and they listen for 8 shot sounds, for example, and they find 8 shot sounds and they say, okay, that's all there are. But there really is quite a bit more to that recording. We'll be talking about that later. The second discovery within those 13 shot sounds, we found 2 instances of what I call double shots. And those are 2 shots that occur so closely together as to make it difficult to perceive how that could possibly have come from a single weapon. As a matter of fact, last year, the Discovery Times channel, to try to prove or disprove that, they rented an Ivor Johnson Cadet 55, the same exact model that Sirhan had in that kitchen pantry. And they had a firearms expert in California, Phil Spangenberger, try to test fire, or rapid fire that gun. And they tried several different ways of doing it, firing 8 shots as rapidly as they could. They took an average of that, which turned out to be 366 milliseconds apart. And then they tried having him just fire a 2-shot sequence as fast as he could, and that actually was worse. Came out around 500 milliseconds between shots. The 2 double shots that exist on the Brzezinski recording, one of them is about 120 to 122 milliseconds apart. The other is about 147 to 148 milliseconds apart. So that's about 3 times the speed that this world-class firearms expert was able to achieve under ideal conditions. And we have to consider the fact that at the time that Sirhan was firing, certainly after the second shot, his gun hand wrist had been pinned down on the steam table by Carl Euchre, the assistant maitre d', and Euchre's other arm had Sirhan in a headlock. So that's hardly what one would consider to be ideal conditions, much less the frame of mind that Sirhan may have been in at the time that the shooting occurred. So that, we thought, was in and of itself. Now, people can argue, was it 13 shots, was it 14, was it 12? The point is, as Bob pointed out, the capacity of Sirhan's gun was 8 shots, period. He did not have time to reload, so even a 9th shot would be indicative of the presence of a second gun. There's just no 2 ways about it. Again, what we found was 13. Second discovery, the 2 instances of the double shots, simply you cannot fire an Ivor Johnson Cadet 55 that rapidly. Plain and simple, impossible. That additional work in going through the validation process of these shot sounds led to a 3rd discovery, and the 3rd discovery gets a little bit more involved from a technical standpoint. But basically what it involves is the finding of a frequency anomaly. And what was done was to look at those 13 individual shot sounds and to take what I call frequency slice measurements. In other words, to look at a particular very narrow band of frequencies across all of the different shots and look for similarities or differences or whatever. Again, this was first done as part of the process to try to determine whether or not these were all gunshots as opposed to firecrackers or balloons or whatever. We'll get into some of that interesting detail later on as well in terms of the distinctions, very, very sound distinctions between them. But anyway, what we found was a frequency anomaly, one particular frequency, 1600 hertz, that presented in 5 of the gunshot sounds and not in any of the others, only in 5. As a researcher, as an engineer, a scientist, that I just found totally confounding. It just trying to figure out what could possibly have caused this. We thought about, well, maybe it was Brzezinski's recorder, because after all, it was a consumer-grade recorder, or his microphone, or the acoustics in the room, or something the FBI did, or something like that. But seeing as how all 13 of these shots occurred within a very short span of time, within about 5 seconds, and we also know that the gun or guns in the kitchen pantry didn't move a whole heck of a lot during that 5 seconds. Sirhan's arm was pinned down on a steam table. Kennedy's position did not change very much. The person who shot Kennedy basically at point-blank range. Other than falling to the floor, the position of that gun also couldn't have changed very much during the time in which the shots were fired. So anyway, make a long story short, it's just a summary part. The basic finding was this frequency anomaly that was later confirmed through an independent firing range test using the same type of gun that Sirhan had, an Ivor Johnson Cadet 55, finding no frequency anomaly with that within those frequency bands. The second gun that we tested was an H&R 922, and we'll get into some interesting things about that weapon a little bit later. But the H&R 922 did in fact exhibit that resonance at 1600 hertz, at the same frequency, and primarily as measured from behind. And that would have been the positioning of the H&R 922, the second gun, basically facing in an easterly direction. We'll show you the diagrams later. And about 40 feet east of Brzezinski's microphone and recorder at the time that the recording was made. So this frequency anomaly presented itself with this particular make and model of the second gun. It did not present itself at all with the Ivor Johnson at any frequency within the frequency range. So we feel pretty comfortable in concluding that the likely second gun was in fact an H&R 922, and that gun has some very interesting characteristics as compared to the Ivor Johnson Cadet 55. So those were the 3 findings basically, and I think each of the 3 can stand by itself in terms of defining the presence of a second gun in that kitchen pantry. And the 3 of them together with the physical evidence that Dr. Jolink has begun to speak about, I think makes an extremely strong case for the fact that, first of all, Robert Kennedy could not have been shot by Sirhan just on the basis of the physical positioning, the 12 or more eyewitnesses that put Sirhan in front of Mr. Kennedy, not behind him. The testimony of Mr. Schrade here, who was standing a few feet behind Kennedy at the time that the shots began. So you take the physical evidence alone, you marry that together with the forensic scientific evidence that we now have, and I think we've built a very strong case in contention with the statement made by Chief of Police Ed Davis back then, in which he called this very much an open and shut case, and we'll show you a little film clip of that later on. So.
Before we go on, Dr. Pepper is here, and he has to catch an airplane, and so if it's okay with John Judge and with you people sitting out here, we would very much prefer, if he wishes, to have him go on at this point. And when he is finished, then we will pick up from where we are now and present our positions.
Is he here?
Yes, he's sitting over there.
It's fine, it's okay with you.
Let me just,
I wanted to I wanted to hear the panel and see as much as possible. But
Well, all right.
Oh, we can go ahead.
We can go ahead.
Yeah, that's all right,
If you
yeah.
want us to go ahead, we'll go ahead, and how long do you want to talk?
if 9 o'clock is okay for me to come on, if that's.
All right,
All right, we
we'll
should-
quit at 9, and then we'll let you go on, and we'll go back if we have to.
Okay.
Now,
Thanks.
here we have two experts in their fields, and Dr. Jolink was also a judge. And the media attention we've had since February, when this panel first, when Phil first presented his information about this second gun and based on the tape, the media has been very good to us. They haven't called us
names yet.
Haven't called it, not yet. But I don't think they can, because these guys are scientists.
Yeah.
And CSI is very important in people's lives now,
Yeah.
right now. The important thing about the tape is that it was discovered by Brad Johnson, a reporter writer for CNN. And he went through all of the tapes in the archives, all the journalist tapes in particular. What happened was, we left the platform, the victory speech. Bob came in and said to me, "I want you and Jess with me at this press conference." He turned around and shook hands with a couple of guys in the kitchen, which was very important at that time, and then the shooting took place. Now, the journalists with Robert Kennedy at that point were going to this press conference on the other side of the pantry, had turned their tape recorders off. Only one tape recording was continued by Brzezinski. And that's what we're talking about here. And here we are 40 years later, beginning to understand really what happened that night. And we also have to thank Tom Bradley for this, who was mayor at the time, because we fought for 20 years to get the police files out of its hands, because they were destroying evidence, and they destroyed very important evidence. And it finally wound up in the California State Archives, where Brad Johnson discovered these tapes and checked out all the tapes and found this particular one. And that's why we're here tonight.
Is John Judge, he had said something about having questions at this point?
You want to, or could you?
Maybe we should hold them in the interest of
Yeah,
being able to finish at 9
Yeah.
and have.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, then we'll go on.
So Bob and Phil will continue with their presentation. It's off camera at this point.
I'm not moving away from you, Paul, because you did put your deodorant on. I'm putting, so you see that screen
Was that what it was?
You smell pretty good.
You smell pretty good. You stink pretty good. I smell you stink. Isn't that
Now-
what Webster said?
The filming is over at this point, right?
Yes.
Yes, the cameras
Okay.
have to leave.
Yes, we have to make a request that any cameras or recorders of any kind are turned off at this
That's
point.
including you, Ralph.
And, we'll
Sorry.
Bring them back on, and you're certainly welcome to stay.
The man with the video camera is Mark Sobel.
Why should we care after 40 years? Well, you know, I've always, some people ask me that, why? One back. One back. Okay, the next one. Forward. Next one, forward, forward. There we are. Let me know when you're done filming that, to your satisfaction.
Could you repeat what you said?
Sure. What language? Say it in Dutch, Kleinjaar? Okay, what legal issues do you see? First of all, the corpus delicti.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I meant the one after this, when we get to the one after this.
doing fine.
Okay. What legal issues do you see? Now, there may be more legal issues than this, so don't please say this is all there is. This is just something that popped into my mind when I was preparing the slide. The corpus delicti. Spoliation. Assistance of counsel. Failure to make appropriate motions. Disclosure of exculpatory evidence. Destruction of evidence before appeal. Veracity of witnesses. Conjuring false evidence, schematics, and any other mal or misfeasance that occurred. Conspiracy theories. The authors do not rely on any conspiracy theory whatsoever to prove the premises and conclusions presented. The authors neither accept nor reject theories of those investigating potential conspiracy theories. All avenues of inquiry are worthy of consideration, even that of a potential conspiracy within the LA hierarchy to cover up an horrendously botched investigation into the death of RFK.
Bob, could you say that in your own words, sort of the way you did originally without actually reading it, just to let us know?
Which part?
Just what you mean in your own words.
Oh, surely. Phil and I do not, for our purposes, to make our determinations from the physical facts or from the forensic science end of it, from the audio engineering aspect of it, we do not rely on any conspiracy theory. We rely just on the facts and just on the scientific evidence. We do not accept nor reject theories that investigating people are doing that have potential for a conspiracy theory being correct or incorrect. We don't accept or reject that. We think that all avenues of inquiry are worthy of consideration, even that of potential conspiracy within the LA hierarchy to cover up a harmlessly botched investigation into the death of RFK. Why should we care after 40 years? I said, you think of the high numbers of death row inmates who have been exonerated by DNA. I mentioned 277 that I knew at the last count. I'm sure there's more by now. Think of the number of people without the status of a U.S. senator running for presidency who have been convicted on far less evidence than that which was falsely presented in this case. And then I asked the question, the sanctity of justice requires it. In other words, if we're going to protect our justice system, we must have the truth. It can't go on and just be expediently mishandled, as I say in this case. And our conclusion is, Sirhan did fire a gun that injured 3 people on June 5, 1968. Therefore, he did, in fact, assault persons with a deadly weapon with the intent to commit murder. He is not to be exonerated, and if indeed Sirhan was hypno-programmed, as many claim, that issue should be raised, proven, and determined in a court of law. If anyone else acted out of psychiatric hysteria conversion, let the issue be determined in court. Now, the last thing that's up there, let me explain that. Those of us who have been in service and have been in combat, we realize that sometimes a person gets a gun, and for the first time, they shoot, and they freeze. They freeze on the trigger. I've seen in the aircraft where the barrel is actually bent from the heat caused by somebody freezing on the gun. They do go ape sometimes. They get hysterical. And whether or not that happened in this case, we don't know. But I don't know of any defense that I can think of that would exonerate anybody unless there was a psychiatric conversion at that moment. And that would be very difficult to prove. I throw it only out here only for what potential may be out there. Next, please. Again, we make this warning. The presentation is subject to copyright law. No copying or reproduction by any means of any material presented is permitted without the express written permission of the presenters. Violators are subject to penalties of law, so you understand that. Next, please. Goodbye. That's the end of what I'm going to say, and the next person will be Phillip Van Praag. Well, yeah, Phil, I think we'll have William Pepper now. It's 5 to 9. Okay? Bill? All right. When you leave here tonight, understand what you've seen is our opinion from our investigation. Nothing is cast in stone in this world, but we have tried our best to be as honest and truthful as possible. And our agenda is just that. We'll get questions afterwards. Hey, Bill. You're on.
Yeah. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Sounds pretty good. We don't have much time because Dr. Pepper has to leave in about 30 minutes. And so I will defer whatever comments I have to after his presentation. But what I will say to you is that the work that Dr. Pepper did and is doing to help us understand the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is work that has changed my life. And in fact, I had written half a dissertation in international affairs. But because of my interest in the COINTELPRO era, the counterintelligence program, the papers that have been released by our government with respect to the counterintelligence program, its impact on people like me across this country, my status as a mother, trying to raise a son, trying to understand what the forces were that were operating in our environment that would prevent my son from reaching his fullest potential. And what I found was the work of one remarkable, remarkable man who was a friend of the King family and who did a lot of work to expose the role of the United States government and others in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, because of John Judge, I had the opportunity to meet Lawrence Teeter. And I can tell you that Lawrence Teeter was dedicated to proving the innocence in a court of law where it matters of Sirhan Sirhan. And so now we've got Dr. William Pepper, who provided a ray of light for those of us who were trying to figure out how April 4th, 1968 could happen. As a person of the Catholic faith, of course, what happened with Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy before was important. And so now all of that is coming together in the arsenal of one man, Dr. William Pepper, who will now be defending Sirhan Sirhan. So I bring to you Dr. William Pepper. Oh yeah, and he's out there with us 911 truthers because he wants to know the truth about what happened on September 11th as well.
I hate to follow that lady. Very embarrassing. Thank you for coming, and John Judge, thank you for organizing this this gathering and this awakening effort. I guess I'm a new kid on the block in terms of Bob Kennedy's assassination. So I want to acknowledge the work of Ted Chirac and Bill Turner, who's over there on the left behind Bob Jolink. Also Phil Melanson, who was a dear friend of mine and who many of you know died not so long ago as a result of leukemia, who had done work on both the King and the Kennedy assassination cases. Now, there's been a lot of groundwork done, a lot of valuable groundwork done on this case, and the most impressive work that I've seen in many years is what Bob Jolink and Phil Van Praag have developed in this case. And Bob, of course, has been at this for so very long, and Phil very diligently has now come up with startling new evidence. With the technological ability that now exists and the equipment that he's developed that exists to show what they have outlined in terms of the firearms evidence, it's quite clear that Sirhan could not have shot and killed Bob Kennedy. I guess I knew Larry Teeter somewhat and consulted with him off and on as he worked on the case, and watched him try to struggle through the courts. It's not an easy task in a case like this. These are very political cases. This marks the 30th year of my work on the assassination of Martin King.
And so it's a long, long struggle. I stayed on the consulting sidelines with Larry for a long while after he died, and the file was passed on to me, and I looked at it. It became very clear to me that this was an easier case. Evidentiary, in terms of evidence, it was an easier case than the assassination of Martin King and the innocence of James Earl Ray. Sirhan, from the outset, had no defense at all. Bob was a little kind for Mr. Cooper. I won't go into some of the problems that beset him and caused him to act the way that he did, in my view, but Sirhan had no defense. His plea was not even a reasonable plea. How do you plea and then get the death penalty? That's absurdity in the extreme. Back in those days, even Tom Noguchi's report, the medical examiner's report, which has now been confirmed scientifically by Bob and Phil's work, indicated quite clearly that Bob Kennedy was shot from the rear, that there were powder burns, and that Sirhan was 3 to 5 feet in front of him, according to a number of the witnesses that supported that. So that case appeared to be an easier one, but it still is fraught with all the political problems that these cases face because of the people who develop these plots. I reflected earlier on the fact that I actually knew Bob Kennedy before I met Martin King. I was Bob Kennedy's Citizens Chairman, Westchester County, New York, when he ran for the Senate in 1964. He was known as a carpetbagger. He came into New York State. And Bob asked me to handle that campaign in that heavily Republican county, which I did. So in a sense, Paul and I were both workers in perhaps different vineyards, but and at different times, but for this man. And then I went off and did some other things after that campaign and ended up in Vietnam as a journalist. And that horrific experience there was what threw me in with Martin King. But who I thought was assassinated by a lone gunman for 9 years, till Abernathy came to me and said, "Now, would you look into this?" And 1978, we began that struggle. So now we begin really, in many ways, afresh, a new struggle. But with the work of people like Ted and Bill Turner and John Christian, and now this incredible work of Bob Jolink and Phil Van Praag, we have a foundation, at least, in which we can build. We have two problems in this case. In order to get this man an evidentiary hearing, in order to get him a new trial, we have two problems to overcome. They've helped greatly with respect to the first problem. That is that Sirhan demonstrably can be shown not to have assassinated Bob Kennedy. He can be shown to be innocent of that crime. And that is clear on the basis of their work. But the second problem is the most difficult one, my friends. The second problem deals with the other 5 counts that Bob referred to. Those are 5 counts of attempted murder. And if we go forward with just the evidentiary evidence that we have here, the corporate media being what it is, the justice system being what it is, they will say, well, okay, maybe he didn't shoot the senator. Maybe there was someone else involved in that. But he did shoot. Those 5 other people had this intention to kill. And so therefore he's a criminal, he's a felon, he's an attempted murderer. So we have to deal with what's known in law as the mens rea. We have to deal with the issue of this man's mental capacity at the time. I spent 2.5 hours with him recently. Well, not so recently, but not very long ago. And you spend time with Sirhan these days if you're his counsel, and my associate Laurie Dusick is going to be with him tomorrow. You spend time with him with a glass wall or a glass window in front of you because he's in SHU, he's in maximum secure housing unit, and lawyers cannot have any contact with the client. Neither can doctors or psychiatrists. So they've advised us. But it's quite clear to me from that portion of time and from reading of the record and his comments and statements and statements of other people that he simply does not remember whole blocks of facts and times what went on. He has a blank stare when issues and people are raised with him. We don't talk in these circumstances when you visit a client about sensitive things, but you put up something to a window so he can read, and you ask him to shake his head or indicate a yes or no. And it's quite clear that he simply has no recollection of many of the events which are critical to mounting a defense for him. So we have come to the strong belief that he in fact has that memory has been altered hypnotically, and he probably was at some point in time hypno-programmed for a particular role, and that's what we now have to attack. We have a habeas proceeding coming up. We'll have to try to roll it over. Larry, we've rolled it over several times already. Larry had provided that petition before he died, so we're left with that, and it's quite broad in terms of its content, so we can deal with that. But I would like very much to have another proceeding before we ultimately have to respond and go into court on the habeas issue. We would like very much to do something similar to what we did in the King case, to have a civil trial, and that civil trial produce all of the evidence that we can under oath that would show effectively that this man was not in control of his own actions at that time, and therefore is not guilty in terms of having the conscious ability to carry out these acts. So we will have crossed that second hurdle if we can do that. Now, to do that, we will have to lay a foundation for the whole program of hypno-programming and the use of hypnotism and chemicals that was used by the Central Intelligence Agency and the Air Force, as well as naval intelligence, all of the forces, intelligence forces of the government combined to participate in these programs from the late 90s all the way through into the 70s. We will call as a witness Alan Shefflin, who is the leading expert probably in the world in terms of these programs, to lay a foundation. Alan sued the CIA, and he was able to obtain thousands of documents that showed what the agency was about. And friends, once you start to understand the scope of the programs that they were about, the horror just boggles the mind. I don't need to go into some of the details of the use of children, the kidnapping of children, and the use of children for various tasks throughout, ruining their lives and throughout many years of their early development. But so we'll lay that foundation. And then we will bring on, hopefully, a leading psychologist, and we're using, in my view, the finest in the world, who will be able to deal with Sirhan in particular. Now, we're trying to get that opening at the prison and the corrections to be able to have him visited by this psychologist over an extended period of time. We're being blocked in every way. They're not answering letters, they're not answering phone calls. They're going to clearly force us into court. That's the way it's looking at this point in time. If we have a civil proceeding, we may get an order from a judge that says to the Department of Corrections, let these people have access to this inmate so that they can assess his mental state of mind, his state of mind at this point in time, and regress him to the extent that one can. Not hypnotically. There's a process called cognitive restoration. The cognitive interview starts way back and moves very skillfully through a person's life to jog the memory, but the person is always conscious when it's being done. So under California law, a deposition following that type of procedure would be admissible. And so that is the process that we hope to follow. But they say now, even a psychologist has to have that glass because it's maximum security rules. Well, what they didn't tell me, what I didn't know, was that there is in this state what's known as the California Treatment Module. And the way I learned about it was I called this whole Department of Corrections is under a receivership. And I called the deputy receiver, or deputy master for psychiatric psychological services. And he said to me, I didn't tell him who the inmate was, and he said to me, well, why don't you use the California treatment module? That's what they use, maximum security prison. I said, well, what's that? Oh, explain that to me. He said, well, it's a room, it's a booth, 3 times the size of a telephone booth, and there's a table that comes out in front, and the medical examiner sits on one side and the inmate on the other. And that's how they give treatment. So, of course, they have that facility here. But they didn't tell us anything about it. So we wrote to them and said, well, now, you have this facility. Let us use it, please. And, of course, those are the letters that have gone unanswered. So we will ultimately have to go to court. And I think that's what they want us to do, because that just prolongs it and drags us on. An alternative would be to recommend to Sirhan that he go back into PHU, protective housing. We're not going to do that because that will open him up to potentially being killed and being murdered, and that ends the case if that happens. So we're starting down this road, and those of you who followed this case, been with it for a long time, I can only ask you just to watch it as it goes each step of the way, because we think ultimately we're going to win, thanks to the work of people like Bob and Phil and a number of other witnesses and people who are going to come forward. We're going to win. As I got involved in this case, we learned, actually through our dear friend over here, Paul Schrade, we learned of a potential witness somewhere else in this state. We followed up on that initial contact, and we ended up 2 weeks ago flying 2 witnesses into New York. One of those people was convinced he had been involved in this assassination, and was convinced that he had played a role in it, but couldn't remember any of these things because he was abducted when he was 8 years old. He was brutalized. He was obviously subjected to hypnotic programming, and he was, throughout his years up to the time of the assassination and somewhat beyond, manipulated and used by people who had a role in the assassination, in his view. So we had started to work with that witness. And I think others will come forward once they realize that there's a possibility that their truth, their stories will make a difference, and that's really what we are hoping will be the case. I think that any support, any ideas that you have, any information that you have, or people you know have about this case, please don't hesitate to contact us and give it to us. It's going to be a long struggle. You know, Bob Kennedy was a very different guy in 1968 than he was in 1964. To me, it was remarkable how that man could change when he went into Mississippi and West Virginia, and he began, as Paul said, to see through the eyes of the impoverished of this land. He changed dramatically, and he was a threat. He was a threat and the only alternative they saw that they had was to get rid of him. Same thing with Martin King, who was going to bring 500,000 people to Washington the spring of '68. And the army was convinced he was going to lose control of that tent city, and that those angry, impoverished Americans would rise up as a revolutionary force and take control of the nation's capital. And as I looked back on it, I think Ian and Martin and I had discussed that possibility because of his total commitment to nonviolence. But as you look back on it, they didn't have the troops to put down that kind of rebellion, and it was a legitimate fear. Bob Kennedy, they couldn't stop. Bob was the original conspiracy theorist in terms of the killing of his brother. He was going to reopen that investigation. Bill Atwood, the managing editor of Look magazine, told me that when he called him at 1 o'clock in the morning following a session Atwood and I had during the day, he said, Bob told him that he knew what had to be done, but he needed the White House to do it. So he was going to reopen all of that case once again, in addition to ending the war in Vietnam, which would go to the bottom of the bottom lines of the corporations in this country. He was going to do that. And he was going to do something else, which is probably more sinister to the wealth of the people who run this country than anything else. He was going to take on the 27.5% oil depletion allowance, as was his brother. And he was going to cut it or eliminate it, and therefore end the billions of profits that the major oil companies in this country and the major independents in the state of Texas. Texas is critical, my friends, to all of these issues, and he was going to end that. So they, I'm sure, felt that they had to eliminate this man, and they had it on the cards for a long time. Now, let's let these famous expression of Malcolm's, let's let these chickens come home to roost. These chickens come home to roost. Let us root out the rot in this republic, because if we don't do it through finding the truth in cases like this, it'll go on and on and on. So we have to do it. Thank you. Much as we make a point of trying to find the truth with respect to the Kennedy assassination, as our friend here has said, the whole 9/11 issue is one that I've been also pulled into in New York, and that is in an effort to create a new 9/11 commission to open up that whole investigation by referendum in the city of New York. And I've spoken to people throughout the world whose names are household words, and they have agreed to serve as commissioners on that body if it ever gets that far. I've also taken on the case of the Jersey girls, who many of you may know, who lost their husbands in the World Trade Center, and we are planning very specific litigation on their behalf that deals only with the money and where the money came from for 9/11. So all of these things wrapped together in terms of a cause to try to save this republic, which is, in my view, in great, great jeopardy. You don't have Defense Authorization Act, Military Commissions Act, and Enhanced Patriot Act, and you don't have this kind of legislation, and Kellogg, Brown, and Root getting $385 million to build encampments in every state of the Union, 2 in every state, supposedly for illegal immigrants. You know, like we're afraid of, up in Maine, they're going to have illegal immigrants coming down from Canada, Vermont, and New Hampshire. 2 of these are being built in every state of the Union. So the Republic is in peril. We have a group, in my view, and here I am political, and I respect Bob not being and Phil not being. I'm highly partisan because I believe the country is run by a group of criminals who have taken over this system. And we're going to have to deal with these criminals, and there is a plan there for an attempt to have them prosecuted, and on the basis of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and violation of the rights of conventions for dealing with the rights of the children, as well as the Torture Convention. All of these areas open these group of criminals, about 15 of them, open to criminal prosecution when they leave office. And if it does not happen in this country, and I have research teams now tracing the felonies all the way up the chain of command, so that they're prosecutable crimes. If it does not happen here, and we must give the Justice Department, whether it's under John Edwards or whoever, an opportunity to do it, but when they don't do it, I can tell you, it will be done elsewhere. In Spain or France in particular, it will happen. There will be international prosecutions of these criminals. So I've gone a far afield, but the Kennedy assassination and the crime of killing Bob Kennedy and taking him from us is a part of this entire picture and cannot be separated from it. So as we wage a struggle with respect to that, let's keep these other parallel efforts in mind, and please help in every way that you can. Thank you very much.
question and answer session. Not his presentation.
So we're going back into Phil Van Praag's presentation, but also it's a segment that they don't want recorded or taped, but we will go to question and answer after that and reopen for everybody else, and just going to talk after that. And she also asked Mike Rupert to come up with her because he's done work on the Robert Kennedy case over the years. And yes, Mike here. So right there.
Would you call me, Mike? You? Me? Yeah. Yeah, we did. Yeah. With John Christian. Yeah. So were you talking now?
No, Praag's about to go. I was just letting the president.
Very amusing. I mean, kept it going.
Sorry for slight technical difficulties. Dr. Pepper's comments also brought to mind another book that just came out around April 4th by Lyndon Barston, a researcher that's spoken at COPA.
Recording this up to where you.
When he started. When Van Praag started.
Okay. Can you be on the mic?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too.
I'll go to the podium, Mike. Lift my feet.
Why don't you use one of these, John?
I never seen you look so spryly.
I'm feeling much better. Which is nearly out of office. But Lyndon Barston's book traces actually a totally unknown history to this point, with good documentation of James O'Reilly having himself, apparently in the years in which he was in the Army and came back to a family that said they no longer recognized him, was himself part of programming similar to MKUltra and the things that we're investigating. So Lyndon's unearthed a whole unknown history of James O'Reilly in that regard. And many of the cases show this kind of programming. There was indication with Jack Ruby that he was under some hypnosis at the time and when he was in the jail. And so it's not unknown, and we do know that they have a long history, as Alan Dulles said when he asked to see if the Soviet Union were doing it. Warren wanted to see if Oswald was some kind of a programmed assassin, and Dulles wrote back that since 1948 they had an ongoing program of psychological manipulation for political control. So they had that capability going back into the period of World War II to create programmed assassins, programmed killers, and to wipe out their memory afterwards as part of the debriefing and to do those things. So when you look in detail in these cases, that's one of the things that emerges over and over.